look at an aid debate and just talk about aid, okay? And it's like the whole debate just becomes about aid. But I think you want to give, as particularly as a prop team, and if prop don't do it, talk about it as opposition, is to what exactly does aid mean? How does it get given? What kind of aid is it? Who's it given to? And so forth. Tied aid, I've kind of added sanctions in here, okay? This is how you approach this debate, okay? I'm kind of actually looking at this a little bit from the op perspective, but I suppose these are the questions you need to answer for prop. If you have a debate that's saying we want to tie aid to a particular thing, or sanction a country that doesn't do a particular thing, I'm coming back to my women's rights analogy again. So it's a case of, is the objective itself worthwhile, which we're trying to achieve? That's the first thing you need to prove. In a lot of cases, sometimes as prop it can be completely obvious, but just bear in mind, sometimes op may concede that and say the objective is worthwhile, so human rights is nice and fluffy, or they may say democracy. So for example, democracy, if you're saying we would tie aid to progress on holding free and fair elections, op can concede that and say, look, we think free and fair elections are a good idea, we just wouldn't tie aid to it. Or they can say, we actually think free and fair elections would be crazy because it's Saudi Arabia and we'll just end up with God knows who in power, okay? The next one then, I suppose, is the question is, will negative consequences be worse than any potential benefits? So it's a case of, yes, you may be able to coerce them into improving women's rights, but you may anger the religious right in that country so much, they suddenly turn against you and start supporting terrorists. So think about the knock-on effects. And this is the key one that comes back to what I was saying earlier on in relation to the earlier debate we say about any sort of, I mentioned I think in relation to sanctions, is will the mechanism actually bring about the change? Will it happen? Because you can oppose debates, these sort of debates, purely on that. You have to prove that this will actually bring about the change, or at least has a good chance of doing it, because otherwise what's the point? That is something which I think gets missed. A lot of the time someone will stand up and say, here's why women's rights are good, here's why there won't be whatever other effects. They never tell us why it is that, we'll say, tying this aid is likely to see that government make a change, and often win those debates a lot on that basis. Governance. How about your time? Okay, I think I'm running out of time, so I'm going to go.
You have 5 minutes, I think.
Yeah, I'm going to fly. Consider the specific problems developing nations have, and the arguments as to which the model will provide more, more stability. So, like, governance typically comes down to kind of like dictatorship. I'm kind of saying on one extreme, / fluffy liberal democracy on the other side, okay? Most developing nations tend to be somewhere in the middle, and a lot of the debates tend to be saying, like, we should push you to have whatever, more rights for monkeys, or more rights for rabbits, whatever it may be. Some sort of a human rights goal, or maybe something about elections specifically, okay? So I want to say, specifically on the topic of, we'll say, elections, or giving power back to your courts, or governance issues, okay? Bear in mind a couple of things. I mentioned this earlier. Bear in mind the common presence of minorities and what's going to be the impact on that. Whether you're talking about Africa, whether you're talking about South America, less so in South America, to be fair, because the minorities tend to be very small. But in some countries like Bolivia, it can actually be quite controversial. But it's a case of, if you've got a significant minority in the country, you can argue quite well both sides of that in terms of saying, is it going to be better for that minority, and indeed better for the country overall, to have a strong, stable dictatorship, or is it better to have a democracy? Because we'll say a democracy may be a situation where, if you have elections like in Iraq, where political parties have basically, not in all cases, but largely broken down along ethnic lines. So you can say, there's a very strong argument for saying that democracy in Iraq is completely dysfunctional, because people are just going to vote for their ethnic kin, and you haven't really, whether you have a real functioning democracy, I don't know. The example, which I think comes up a lot in debates, is Tito as the leader of Yugoslavia. He was there, he managed to hold the country together for decades and decades, and then when he died, the country basically fell apart and splintered into, I think, 6 countries now. So it's a case of, if you look at that, it's a case of, it's an argument which you certainly can use from the prop side in a debate about why dictatorship may be better. But also think about, I'll come back again to the long term. Maybe part of the reason why you had such a bloody civil war in Yugoslavia was because of the fact that it was held together with such force earlier on, just caused those tensions between communities to become even more aggravated. So it's a case of, you can argue it both ways, but I would say be very mindful in any sort of a governance debate about what are the divides within that society. If it's Africa, is it going to break down on tribal lines? is it going to break down on religious lines? What is it going to break down on? How well, if they're arguing for democracy, how well will democracy actually work in that country? And look at it both in the short term, in terms of can you actually get a stable government? And two, like in the long run, is a democracy going to make those tensions worse? Or is it going to make it better? Is a dictatorship going to calm things down? Or is it just going to, whatever? I'm saying dictatorship and democracy as kind of the two extremes. Likely you'll end up somewhere in the middle, do you think? The issue is not whether the underlying issue will get worse. And consider the prevalence of wars that are based on just countries falling apart, particularly in Africa. And just that can be a very strong argument for saying there are some things worse than not having democracy. Social change, okay? Once again, there are a million things you could try and advocate for. I've been using a lot the example of women's rights because I think it's an interesting one, and because you've all been listening about feminism earlier on. But can outside pressure change the social value, okay? And I think there's probably two things. Can it change the value, and can it change the rules and the law? And I think that's where you come back to the long-term thing as well. I would very much bear in mind that you, as much as possible, need to try and argue that it will or that it won't actually change the value. So it's a case of, will women's rights be something which will become respected in those countries? So on one side you can argue that, no, we should take a softly approach, let women's rights develop organically. On the other hand, you can say, no, we just need to force it through, let the law be changed, women will go out and get jobs, and then people's values will change because they will see that women in the workplace is not actually a disaster. So you can argue it both ways. By the way, I'm sounding like an awful misogynist here, but I'm not. I'm just using it as an example, I suppose, of the rhetoric that can be applied. But it's a case of, even, so it comes back to, even if you can change it, will it be sustainable? Will there just be a backlash that will mean that in 5 years' time when your aid isn't as important anymore because it's not raining and your rivers aren't overflowing? Does it mean that they won't just reverse the policy later on, or because that government will just get voted out and another will force things along, when this sort of rights change or democracy is just happening anyway? So for example, in the case of China, I think if you were ever having a debate there in democracy, there's a very strong argument for saying, don't try and push things along. China is liberalizing gradually for their own reasons. Affluence, the development of the middle class there, people themselves are pushing for it. We don't need to do anything. China, we will concede, is not perfect, but we think that that change will happen itself. And I think you can argue that about an awful lot of countries. So for any sort of a social value, I think you can argue almost always that there's very few cases where I can think of saying that no change will happen on its own. You need to be prepared to argue why that change will happen itself, whether it be because of rising economic affluence and people's changing attitudes, or just whatever, people's fraying tensions of the government, like Iran or whatever it may be. And then I come back to this again, how does this change underpin or damage other goals? So for example, in particular the economic ones. So it's a case of, you come back and say, one of the biggest priorities for developing nations, you can come back and say, is not the social issues, but it's about so that people have money to put bread on the table. You come back to the economic issue at the end of the day.